Dust motes suspended in the stale air-conditioned draft of Mr. Abernathy's office seemed to hold their breath. Cora watched them swirl against the wood-panelled wall, her mind deliberately detaching from the drone of the lawyer's voice. She focused instead on the smell. Leather polish old paper and the suffocating heavy floral perfume radiating from her mother-in-law Beatrice. It was a scent that always reminded Cora of funeral parlours, which was fitting, considering they had buried Arthur exactly 4 days ago. Beatrice sat ramrod straight in the wingback chair to Cora's left, her manicured fingers clutching a leather Prada handbag like a shield. Beside her sat Richard Arthur's older brother, radiating the kind of smug impatience unique to men who wore tailored suits on a Tuesday afternoon. Neither of them had looked at Cora since she walked in. They treated her presence as a clerical error they simply had to endure until the paperwork caught up with reality. Which brings us to the primary residence, Abernathy said, clearing his throat. His collar looked too tight. He shuffled a stack of thick, cream-coloured pages. As per the addendum filed 6 months prior to his passing, Arthur bequeathed the estate on Elm Street back to his mother Beatrice. Cora felt a sharp, involuntary twitch in her jaw. She bit down hard on her back molars. The Elm Street house, the one she had spent 3 summers gutting breathing in toxic drywall dust, sanding the original hardwood floors until her knees bled all, while Arthur managed the finances. She looked at her hands resting in her lap. The calluses from the orbital sander were still there, rough and yellowed. Naturally, Beatrice murmured, adjusting her silk scarf. It was family money that secured the down payment. It belongs with the family. She didn't say blood family, but the word echoed in the heavy silence anyway. Cora didn't argue. What was the point? Arthur had always been deeply pathologically afraid of his mother's disapproval. Even in death, he was still apologizing to her. Moving on to the liquid assets and the joint brokerage accounts. Abernathy continued refusing to make eye contact with Cora now. Those have been transferred to Richard to be held in trust for the expansion of the family firm. Richard leaned back, crossing his ankle over his knee. Arthur knew I could yield a better return on that capital. He always struggled with market volatility. Cora's chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean by a dull spoon. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of balancing budgets, clipping coupons, working double shifts at the clinic, so Arthur could pursue his entrepreneurial phases. And he had signed it all away to a brother who had once sued him over a scratched fender. The betrayal wasn't a sudden stab. It was a slow, agonizing leak. She felt nauseous, the kind of sick that sits low in the gut and tastes like copper. And for Cora, Abernathy said, his voice dropping half an octave. He pulled a single, significantly thinner sheet of paper from the bottom of the pile. The deed and total ownership of the property located at 440 County Route 9. Beatrice let out a sound that was half scoff, half cough. Richard actually smirked. Cora blinked. County Route 9. She dug through her exhausted, grief-fogged brain for a second before it clicked. The shed. 3 years ago, Arthur had bought a tax-delinquent patch of scrubland at a municipal auction. He claimed it was going to be his workshop, a place to restore vintage motorcycles. He'd poured thousands into it, money they didn't have, buying a reinforced steel shed, pouring a concrete slab, laying down a heavy-duty access road. Then, like all his projects, he got bored. The motorcycles never materialized. The property just sat there eating property taxes, collecting rust and whatever junk Arthur couldn't fit in their garage. A junk shed, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. Well, Cora, I suppose it gives you a place to store your things when you vacate Elm Street. I'll need you out by the end of the month, dear. I have contractors coming in to fix that dreadful kitchen backsplash you chose. Cora looked at Beatrice. Really looked at her. The older woman's face was tight with Botox and triumph. Cora felt a sudden violent urge to reach across the mahogany desk and slap the foundation right off her cheekbones. But the anger flickered and died, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She was 32, widowed, effectively homeless, and broke. Fighting these vultures would require a reserve of energy she simply did not possess. "Fine," Cora said. Her voice sounded raspy, foreign to her own ears. Abernathy slid the deed across the polished wood. It came with a heavy rusted brass key on a greasy metal ring. Cora picked it up. It felt cold and jagged against her palm. "Just sign the releases, Cora," Richard said smoothly, tapping a silver pen against the desk. "Let's wrap this up. I have a tea time at 4. She signed. She didn't read the fine print. She didn't care. She signed away the house, the money, the 8 years of sweat equity keeping only her name, and the deed to a tin can in the middle of nowhere. When she stood up, the chairs scraped loudly against the floorboards. Neither Beatrice nor Richard offered a handshake or a goodbye. Stepping out of the air-conditioned building into the blistering July heat felt like walking into a solid wall. The asphalt of the parking lot radiated waves of distortion. Cora got into her 10-year-old Honda, the seats baking through her thin cotton dress. She shoved the rusted key into the ignition, listening to the engine whine before finally catching. She had nowhere to go. Elm Street wasn't home anymore. It was enemy territory. She looked down at the passenger seat, where the single manila folder containing the Route 9 deed lay. "A junk shed," she muttered aloud, the sound swallowed by the rattling of her AC unit. She put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, turning left toward the county highway. She might as well go see her grand inheritance. Gravel crunched aggressively beneath the balding tires of Cora's Honda as she turned off the 2-lane highway. The access road Arthur had paid a small fortune for was already losing a war against nature. Thistle-aggressive crabgrass and creeping vines pushed through the crushed stone, scraping against the undercarriage of her car like fingernails on a chalkboard. The property was heavily wooded, choked with untamed pines and dense thorny underbrush that blocked out the afternoon sun, casting long bruised shadows. She drove for nearly a quarter of a mile before the trees broke, revealing a crude clearing. Cora put the car in park and just stared through the bug-splattered windshield. It was worse than she imagined. The shed wasn't just a shed. It was a hulking, windowless monolith of corrugated steel about the size of a 3-car garage. The metal, once factory grey, was now bleeding streaks of oxidized orange and brown. It sat on a raised concrete slab that was already cracking at the corners. Surrounding the structure was a moat of absolute garbage. Stacks of dry, rotted tires, a rusted-out chassis of a Ford pickup. Blue plastic tarps pooling with stagnant. Mosquito-infested rainwater, and dozens of unlabeled 5-gallon buckets. It smelled like hot iron decaying leaves, and the sharp chemical tang of old motor oil. "You really outdid yourself, Artie," she whispered to the empty car. Her eyes burned, but she wasn't crying. It was the stinging frustration of realizing you've been entirely played by a man who couldn't even organize his own sock drawer. She killed the engine and stepped out into the humid air. The silence out here was heavy, oppressive. Only the erratic buzz of cicadas broke the stillness. She walked up to the heavy steel roll-up door. A massive industrial-grade padlock secured a heavy chain looped through the handles. Cora looked down at the brass key Abernathy had given her. It didn't look like it belonged to a padlock. It looked older, meant for a deadbolt. She tried it anyway. It wouldn't even slide into the keyhole. She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Of course you gave me the wrong damn key." She stalked back to her car, popped the trunk, and rummaged through her emergency kit until her fingers closed around a heavy steel tire iron. Walking back to the door, a sudden dark surge of adrenaline flooded her system. All the repressed anger from the lawyer's office, the silent seething at Beatrice's smirk, the humiliation of Richard's condescension. It all coalesced into the metal bar in her hands. Cora swung the tire iron overhead and smashed it down on the padlock. Metal cracked against metal. A jarring vibration shot up her forearms, rattling her teeth. She hit it again and again. She swung until she was panting, her dark hair sticking to her sweaty forehead, her hands blistering. On the 7th strike, The rusted internal mechanism of the lock gave way with a sickening crunch. She threw the tire iron into the dirt, yanked the broken lock free, and pulled the chain loose. Grabbing the handle of the roll-up door, she braced her boots against the concrete and heaved upward. The door screamed. Rusted tracks ground against unoiled rollers, a deafening screech that sent a flock of crows bursting out of the nearby pines. Cora pushed the door up until it caught near the ceiling. A wave of trapped superheated air hit her in the face. It smelled deeply of mouse droppings, mildew, and something distinctly metallic like the copper scent of blood, but sharper. Cora stepped into the gloom, squinting as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the open doorway. The interior was a claustrophobic maze of hoarding. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units lined the walls, sagging under the weight of unlabeled cardboard boxes, rusted coffee tins, and tangled nests of copper wire. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden workbench buried under engine parts, empty beer cans, and greasy rags. She walked deeper into the shed, her boots kicking up small clouds of grey dust. It was a monument to a wasted life, Arthur's life. A graveyard of half-baked ideas and abandoned hobbies. She ran a finger along a dusty tarp, covering a bulky shape in the corner. Pulling it back, she coughed as a plume of dust billowed into the air. Beneath it wasn't a motorcycle. It was a massive industrial drill press covered in surface rust. Beside it sat a stack of heavy reinforced plastic totes. Cora knelt, her knees popping, and unlatched the top tote. She expected old magazines or maybe tax returns. Instead, it was filled to the brim with rocks. She frowned, picking one up. It was incredibly heavy for its size, jagged and dull grey, threaded with strange pale yellow veins. She tossed it back. It clattered against the others. Why was he keeping buckets of rocks? She moved to the workbench, pushing aside a pile of spark plugs. Beneath them lay a heavy leather binder, stiff with age and stained with oil. She flipped it open. The pages were filled with Arthur's messy scrawled handwriting, interspersed with printouts of topographical maps and chemical assays. She traced the pen marks. There were circles drawn over the property lines of County Route 9, heavy aggressive circles with notes written in the margins. Core sample 4, positive. ppm exceeding baseline. Keep quiet. Cora's brow furrowed. She flipped to the next page. A folded piece of official-looking paper was tucked into a plastic sleeve. She pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a lab report from a private geological testing facility in Denver, dated exactly 2 weeks before Arthur had his fatal heart attack. Her eyes scanned the dense columns of numbers and abbreviations until she found the summary at the bottom. She read the sentence 3 times. The words didn't make sense, yet they slammed into her brain with the force of a freight train. She dropped the paper on the bench, her heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked back at the plastic tote full of grey, yellow-veined rocks. Then she looked down at the brass key in her pocket, the one that didn't fit the front door. This wasn't a junk shed. It was a vault. Sweat dripped stinging into Cora's right eye, breaking the trance. She wiped it away with the back of a grimy hand, leaving a streak of black grease across her forehead. The paper in her trembling fingers rattled. She read the chemical symbols again. A U, gold. High-yield deposit. The numbers attached to the parts per million column were staggering. Her lungs felt too tight, oxygen refusing to process. Arthur. Her lazy, easily distracted, corner-cutting husband had actually stumbled onto something real. And he hadn't told her. She dropped the lab report onto the workbench. It fluttered down, landing on a stained rag. A sour wave of nausea hit her, born not of excitement, but of a profound, isolating betrayal. If he had found this before he died, why let her keep working back-to-back shifts at the clinic? Why let his mother constantly belittle her for their cramped finances, because he was building his own lifeboat, and she wasn't in it? Cora jammed her hands into the pockets of her sundress, her fingertips grazing the heavy, jagged edge of the brass key. Abernathy had handed it over with such dismissal. Arthur must have kept it on his primary ring, the one the coroner returned to Beatrice, who likely handed it to the lawyer without a second glance. They assumed it was just more junk. She pulled the key out. It was old, heavy, and tarnished dark brown in the grooves. It didn't belong to a modern padlock. It belonged to something substantial. Cora turned away from the workbench and faced the chaotic maze of the shed. "Where are you?" she whispered. Her voice sounded thin and raspy in the cavernous baking hot room. She started at the eastern wall, dragging heavy cardboard boxes off the industrial shelving. Dust rained down on her hair and shoulders, coating her tongue with the taste of dry earth and dead spiders. She found fishing tackle tangled extension cords, a box of rusted spark plugs, and a stack of unpaid credit card statements hidden inside a hollowed-out shop vac. She paused, staring at the envelopes. They were in his name, maxed out, $10,000 on one, $15,000 on another. He had leveraged them into oblivion to fund this secret excavation. If the gold wasn't real, he would have dragged her into a pit of bankruptcy so deep she'd never see daylight. "You selfish bastard," she breathed, her voice cracking. Anger, hot and bright, finally pierced through the fog of grief. It felt good. It felt like fuel. She tossed the bills aside and kept digging. Hours bled away. The oppressive heat inside the corrugated metal walls turned the shed into a slow cooker. Cora's dress clung to her skin, drenched in sweat. Her fingernails were chipped, her knuckles scraped raw from catching on exposed staples and sharp metal edges. By late afternoon, the shadows in the shed had lengthened, turning the junk piles into menacing silhouettes. She had cleared nearly half the floor space, finding nothing but more debris. She leaned against a support beam, panting, a bottle of lukewarm water from her car gripped in her aching hand. Her gaze drifted to the corner where the heavy industrial drill press sat draped in the dusty tarp. She had looked around it, but not under it. It was massive, bolted to a thick pallet. Setting her water down, Cora marched over to the machine. She grabbed the heavy canvas tarp and yanked it off entirely. The drill press was old, heavy cast iron. But as she looked closer at the concrete slab beneath the wooden pallet, she noticed a discrepancy. The concrete everywhere else in the shed was stained with oil and dirt. The concrete directly beneath the pallet was relatively clean, and there was a perfectly straight hairline fracture running along its edge. It wasn't a fracture. It was a seam. Cora threw her weight against the side of the drill press. It didn't budge. She braced her boots against the floor, gritted her teeth, and pushed with everything she had. Her shoulder screamed in protest. The cast iron groaned the pallet, scraping loudly against the concrete. Inch by inch, she forced the massive machine backward. When she had pushed it 2 feet, she collapsed onto her knees, gasping for air. Her chest heaved, pulling in the stale metallic air of the shed. She looked down at the newly exposed floor. Set flush into the concrete was a heavy steel plate, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, painted grey to blend in with the surrounding floor. In the center of the plate was a recessed handle and a heavy brass-rimmed keyhole. Cora's hands shook as she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the tarnished brass key. It felt impossibly heavy now, like a localized center of gravity. She leaned over the steel plate, her breath ghosting against the metal. She inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit. She turned it. A heavy, satisfying clunk echoed from beneath the steel plate. It sounded like a bank vault disengaging. Cora grabbed the recessed handle. It was stiff, fighting her for a second before giving way. She hauled the heavy steel door upward on its concealed hinges. It clanged backward against the concrete, exposing a dark rectangular cavity cut deep into the foundation. A rush of cool, damp air drifted up from the hole, smelling of wet rock and deep earth. Cora leaned over the edge, peering into the gloom. It wasn't just a stash of raw ore. Lined neatly along the bottom of the concrete vault were stack after stack of heavy rectangular canvas bags, the kind used by banks for loose change. But these weren't filled with quarters. One of the bags had tipped over, its thick drawstring loosened. Spilling out onto the cold concrete floor were crude, unevenly poured bars of solid, dull yellow metal. They didn't sparkle like jewelry. They were heavy, dense, and raw. Arthur hadn't just found gold. He had been quietly mining it, smelting it, and hiding it right beneath a pile of garbage. And he had left the deed to the only person his family thought was too stupid to look closely. Panic, cold and sharp, immediately replaced the rush of discovery. Cora slammed the heavy steel trapdoor shut. The thick thud reverberated through the soles of her boots. She frantically turned the brass key locking the vault and pocketed it. Her mind raced, tripping over a dozen terrifying scenarios. If Richard knew about this, he wouldn't just sue her. He would bankrupt her in court, with an army of corporate lawyers claiming the property was purchased with stolen family funds. Beatrice would frame her for fraud. They would strip her to the bone. She had to hide it. She had to secure the perimeter. Cora dragged the heavy drill press back over the seam, her muscles screaming in protest. She threw the dusty tarp back over the machine, meticulously arranging the folds to match how she had found them. She kicked loose dirt and old sawdust over the scrape marks on the concrete. She spent another 20 minutes meticulously replacing every cardboard box and rusted coffee tin she had moved, erasing her own footprints from the dust. By the time she emerged from the shed, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting the scrubland in deep, bruising purples and fiery oranges. The cicadas had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, throaty croak of bullfrogs. She needed locks, real locks, not the cheap, rusted garbage Arthur had used. Cora drove her Honda back down the rutted access road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She hit the county highway and floored it toward the nearest town, a fading strip of strip malls and gas stations about 10 miles away. She found a heavy-duty supply store just before closing time. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed loudly, a harsh clinical glare that made her headache spike. She smelled like a mechanic's rag, and sweat drawing a wary look from the teenage cashier. Cora didn't care. She bought 3 sets of industrial-grade hardened steel padlocks, a heavy-gauge logging chain, and 2 motion-sensor trail cameras. She paid in cash, draining the last $200 from her checking account. Returning to the shed in pitch darkness, illuminated only by the Honda's high beams, she looped the thick logging chain through the roll-up door's handles. She snapped the massive padlocks shut, the heavy click, offering a microscopic fraction of comfort. She mounted the trail cameras in the surrounding pines, angling them toward the entrance. That night, Cora didn't go back to Elm Street. The thought of sleeping under Beatrice's roof, surrounded by Arthur's ghosts and his mother's suffocating perfume, made her skin crawl. Instead, she parked her car in the back lot of a 24-hour diner. She reclined the driver's seat, locked the doors, and clutched her purse to her chest. Inside the purse sat one of the heavy, yellow-veined rocks from the plastic tote and the folded lab report. She slept in shallow, terrifying bursts, waking every hour to the sound of passing semi-trucks. Morning broke with a pale, sickly light and a thick layer of condensation on the inside of her windshield. Cora bought a bitter burnt coffee from the diner and sat in a booth, scrolling furiously through her phone. She couldn't go to a bank. She couldn't go to a corporate jeweler. She needed someone off the grid, someone who understood discretion and raw materials. She found an address for a private metallurgical assayer 2 towns over, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a liquor store in a decaying industrial park. The name on the listing was simply Hollis Metals. 2 hours later, she pushed open the heavy glass door of the shop. A bell chimed cheerfully, violently at odds with the interior. The shop smelled strongly of ammonia, burnt ozone, and old tobacco. Security bars crisscrossed the windows, casting prison cell shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. Behind a scratched plexiglass counter stood a man in his late 50s, wearing a heavy canvas apron over a faded flannel shirt. He had wire-rimmed glasses perched on a bulbous nose and hands scarred from years of chemical burns. "Help you?" Hollis asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't look up from the small digital scale he was calibrating. Cora walked up to the counter. She felt entirely out of her depth, a civilian wandering onto a battlefield. but she thought of Richard's smug face in the lawyer's office, and her spine stiffened. She reached into her purse, pulled out the heavy grey and yellow rock, and set it on the glass counter. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Hollis paused. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes flicking from the rock to Cora's face. He reached out with a pair of heavy tongs, clamped them around the stone, and dragged it closer to his side of the partition. He didn't say a word. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his apron pocket, jammed it into his right eye socket, and leaned in close. He turned the rock slowly under a harsh focused desk lamp. Then he reached for a small dark glass bottle with a glass dropper. "Nitric acid," Hollis muttered, answering her unasked question. "Base metals will react. Fizz. Turn green. Gold won't care." He let a single drop fall onto the thickest yellow vein running through the grey quartz. Cora held her breath. The silence in the shop stretched out thick and heavy. The drop of acid sat on the yellow metal. It didn't fizz. It didn't smoke. It didn't change colour. It just sat there clear and inert, while the metal beneath it gleamed stubbornly in the harsh light. Hollis lowered the loop. He wiped the acid away with a neutralizing cloth and looked at Cora. His demeanour had shifted entirely. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity. "Where did you pull this from, lady?" he asked softly. "That's none of your business," Cora said, surprised by the steady, cold authority in her own voice. "What is it?" "It's wire gold in quartz," Hollis said, leaning heavily against the counter. "Unrefined, high purity. If you have a vein of this, you're not sitting on a gold mine. You're sitting on a damn bank vault. The rock alone as a specimen is worth a few grand. Melted down depends on the yield. But it's rich. Very, very rich." Cora stared at the rock. The hollowed-out feeling in her chest, the grief, the betrayal, the humiliation from Beatrice and Richard. It all suddenly crystallized into something entirely new. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was leverage. Arthur had left her a junk shed, but Beatrice and Richard had forced her to take it. They had laughed at her. They had practically handed her the loaded gun. Cora picked up the rock, dropped it back into her purse and zipped it shut. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hollis. I might be in touch." She walked out of the shop, the bell chiming behind her. The morning air felt cooler now. She looked at her beat-up Honda, then down at her calloused hands. She was going to let Beatrice have the Elm Street house. She was going to let Richard keep his little brokerage accounts. Let them think they won. Because when the time was right, she was going to buy the ground right out from under them. Cora returned to Hollis Metals 3 days later, carrying a faded canvas gym bag that felt like it was filled with bowling balls. The oppressive July heat had finally broken, replaced by a humid, relentless drizzle that slicked the asphalt of the industrial park. She parked her Honda facing the exit, leaving the keys in the ignition. Her stomach churned, a sour mix of gas station coffee and raw adrenaline. She grabbed the bag. The handles bit into her palms. Hollis was in the back room when the door chime announced her arrival. He emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a blue shop towel, his wire-rimmed glasses pushed up into his thinning hair. He didn't smile. He just locked the front door, flipped the open sign to closed, and pulled down the metal security grate over the street-facing window. The clatter of the heavy steel slats echoed in the cramped shop, making Cora flinch. "You brought more than a rock this time," Hollis stated, leaning over the scratched plexiglass. Cora unzipped the bag. She didn't hesitate. She reached in and pulled out 3 of the crude, uneven yellow bars, thunking them onto the counter one by one. They were ugly things, pitted with impurities and soot from Arthur's amateur smelting process, but their density was undeniable. Hollis stared. A slow, low whistle escaped his teeth. He picked one up, testing the heft. He poured these himself, whoever he is, used a cheap graphite mold, didn't burn off all the slag. "Can you melt them down?" Cora asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic that was currently vibrating through her nervous system. "Clean them up. Give me cash. That's a lot of liquidity, lady. And a lot of questions if the IRS comes sniffing around my books." Hollis set the bar down. He looked at her, really looking, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap rain-dampened clothes, the sheer desperate tension radiating from her jawline. I charge 20% for undocumented refining. That's the tax for me, not asking whose name is on the claim. 15. Cora counted, her heart hammering. And I have 20 more of these. You do this right, you get the rest. A muscle feathered in Hollis's jaw. He nodded once. Come back in 4 hours. Bring something bigger than a gym bag. Those 4 hours were the longest of Cora's life. She sat in her car in a nearby strip mall parking lot, watching the rain streak the windshield. She was terrified. She was trusting a man she barely knew with a fortune she didn't legally understand, operating entirely on instinct and spite. She kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting Richard's sleek black Mercedes to pull up behind her. When she returned to the shop, Hollis was waiting. The crude bars were gone. In their place, sitting on a velvet jeweler's pad, were 4 smaller, perfectly smooth, brilliant gold ingots stamped with a generic assayer's mark. Next to them sat a thick-banded stack of $100 bills. 42,000 after my cut. Hollis grunted, sliding the cash toward her. I kept the ingots under the federal reporting weight. You want to sell those, go to a coin dealer in the city. Better yet, go to 3 different ones. Cora picked up the stack of bills. It smelled like ink, old cotton, and dirty hands. It was the smell of leverage. That night, she finally abandoned her car for a bed. She checked into a nondescript motel off the interstate, paying for a week in advance with crisp new bills. The room smelled overwhelmingly of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke, the carpet a sticky, questionable floral pattern. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. She dumped the remaining cash and the 4 small ingots onto the sagging mattress. Then she walked into the tiny, mold-spotted bathroom, turned the shower water as hot as it would go, and stepped in with her clothes still on. She scrubbed the grease, the dirt, and the paralyzing fear off her skin until it was red and raw. She watched the muddy water swirl down the drain, taking the last 3 years of Arthur's lies with it. When she finally stepped out, she wrapped herself in a thin, scratchy towel. She looked at her reflection in the fogged mirror. The grieving widow was gone. The exhausted clinic worker was dead. The woman staring back had cold, flat eyes and an 8-figure war chest buried under a pile of garbage. By 9 the next morning, Cora was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in a glass-walled office in downtown Denver. The brass nameplate on the desk read, Naomi Vance, Corporate Litigation. Naomi was a predator in a tailored skirt suit. She had cropped black hair, a pen spinning restlessly between her fingers, and a reputation for financially disemboweling her opponents. She looked at Cora's cheap clothes with thinly veiled skepticism. My retainer is $10,000, Mrs. Abernathy, Naomi said, smoothly leaning back. And I don't handle simple probate disputes. You need a family lawyer. Cora unzipped her purse. She pulled out a banded stack of $100 bills and tossed it onto the glass desk. It hit with a heavy, authoritative smack. I don't have a probate dispute, Cora said, watching Naomi's eyes lock onto the cash. I have an inheritance. My brother-in-law, Richard Abernathy, stole my husband's liquid assets through coercion, and he's going to use them to expand his commercial real estate firm. I want to build a holding company. I want to mask my assets, and then I want you to help me buy his debt. Naomi stopped spinning the pen. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Well then, let's talk structure. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway of the Elm Street house like a barricade. Cora stood in the foyer, her boots leaving faint, damp smudges on the newly polished hardwood. The air in the house had changed. The faint scent of Arthur's aftershave was completely gone, eradicated by the chemical tang of wet paint and Beatrice's suffocating, heavy floral perfume. Don't scuff the floors, Cora, Beatrice called out from the living room. I just had the contractors refinish them this morning. Arthur always let you drag your shoes inside. It drove me absolutely mad. Cora walked into the living room. The nausea that usually accompanied Beatrice's voice was gone, replaced by a hollow, ringing calm. The floral wallpaper she had spent 3 weekends hanging a soft, muted sage was stripped bare in jagged, violent strips. In its place, a painter was rolling on a sterile, icy white. Richard was leaning against the marble fireplace mantel, scrolling aggressively on his phone. He looked up, his expression tightening with annoyance. "You're late. The movers are coming for your junk tomorrow at 8. I hope you have a storage unit. I'm not paying for one." "I rented a truck." Cora lied smoothly, keeping her voice small, fragile. She dropped her gaze to the floor, playing the part they expected. "It took me a while to scrounge the deposit together. The clinic cut my hours." Beatrice sighed, a sharp intake of breath designed to convey maximum burden. "Well, that's what happens when you lack marketable skills, dear. I told Arthur years ago he needed a wife with a proper career, but he always preferred projects he could fix." She waved a dismissive manicured hand at the stripped walls. Clearly, neither of his projects turned out very well. Cora dug her fingernails into her palms to keep from smiling. 3 days ago, that comment would have sent her spiraling into a bathroom to cry. Today, with a newly minted LLC registered in Delaware and a bank box holding $200,000 in cash and bullion, the insult felt like a mosquito biting armor. She moved toward the kitchen to pack the last of her cheap dishes. Richard followed, his phone still glued to his hand. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from the fridge Cora had bought with her own Christmas bonus. "So," Richard said, not looking at her, "what are you going to do with that eyesore out on Route 9? The county assessor sent a notice to the firm. Arthur was 3 years behind on the commercial zoning taxes. It's got a lien on it." Cora froze, a porcelain mug suspended in her hand. A lien. Arthur, that absolute idiot. He had paid cash for the excavation equipment, poured a $10,000 concrete slab, and ignored the property taxes. "I don't know," Cora said, forcing her voice to waver. She set the mug down, letting her hands shake just a little. "Abernathy said it was mine. I don't have the money for back taxes, Richard. I can barely afford groceries right now. The shed is just full of his old junk. I might just let the county foreclose on it." Richard stopped drinking. He lowered the glass, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was a shark, always sniffing for blood in the water. Real estate was his game. "Foreclose. Do you have any idea how bad that looks on a public record attached to the family name? Beatrice would have a stroke if the papers caught wind that Arthur's widow was defaulting on county taxes." "What do you want me to do?" Cora snapped, letting a manufactured tear well up in her eye. "You took everything else. You took the accounts. You took my house. I have nothing." Richard held up a hand, his face smoothing into a mask of benevolent condescension. "Calm down, Cora. Hysterics won't solve anything. Look, the firm needs a tax write-off this quarter anyway. That scrubland is worthless, but I could buy it off you for a nominal fee. Say $5,000. It covers your immediate expenses, gets you out of my hair, and keeps the family name out of the county foreclosure notices." Cora looked at him, letting her mouth hang open slightly, in feigned shock. $5,000. He wanted to buy a property sitting on a multi-million-dollar gold vein for the price of a used Honda. The sheer suffocating arrogance of the man was almost impressive. He didn't know. He genuinely thought it was worthless. He just wanted to own the final piece of Arthur's failures. $5,000, Cora whispered, clutching a dish towel. "Take it or leave it," Richard said, turning back to his phone. "But if you let it go to auction, I'll make sure Abernathy sends you the bill for the legal headache." "I need to think about it," Cora said, looking away. "It's the last thing I have of his." "Don't be sentimental, Cora. It's a rusted tin can." Richard scoffed, walking back toward the living room. "Call my assistant by Friday, or deal with the county yourself." Cora stood alone in the half-empty kitchen. The tear dried instantly on her cheek. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, heavy brass key. "I'll deal with it myself," she whispered to the empty room. She finished packing her 2 meager boxes of dishes, carried them out to her car, and didn't look back at the house on Elm Street. Let Beatrice have the white walls. Let Richard have his sparkling water. Cora had an appointment with Naomi. It was time to find out exactly how much debt Richard's precious commercial real estate firm was carrying, and exactly how hard she could squeeze his throat before he choked. Naomi slid a thick manila folder across the pristine glass of her desk. It smelled faintly of ozone from the copier and expensive citrus-scented hand sanitizer. Cora didn't open it immediately. She just stared at the stark black letters printed on the tab Abernathy Commercial Holdings. "Your brother-in-law is a very ambitious man," Naomi said, interlacing her fingers. The city skyline of Denver stretched out behind her, a jagged wall of glass and steel. And like most ambitious men who inherited their starting capital, he thinks he's invincible. He's currently developing a mixed-use commercial space in the Pearl District. It's a $40 million project. He's leveraged up to his neck. Cora traced the edge of the folder. How leveraged? He took out a series of high-interest mezzanine loans to cover the construction overages. Naomi explained, tapping a manicured nail against the desk. $3.8 million. It's held by a private equity group out of Chicago. It's toxic debt, Cora. The kind that comes with incredibly aggressive call provisions. If his debt-to-income ratio slips even a fraction of a percent, they can demand full repayment in 30 days. If he defaults, they take the Pearl District project, and they take his primary firm as collateral. Sal. Cora felt a strange cold flutter in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It was the terrifying, intoxicating realization of geometry. The angles were finally aligning. "Can we buy the debt?" Cora asked. "We can..." Naomi smiled a sharp, feral expression. "Through the LLC we just established. The Chicago group would love to offload it for cash. But you need to capitalize the LLC first. I need $4 million in verifiable liquid funds transferred into the corporate trust account by the end of the month. $4 million. The number hung in the sterile, air-conditioned air. Cora thought of the deep, dark vault beneath the heavy steel plate on County Route 9. "I'll have it by Friday," Cora said. She left the law office and drove straight to the industrial park. The next 4 days were a blur of grueling, mind-numbing physical labor. Cora moved into the motel full-time. She slept in 4-hour shifts. When it was dark, she drove to the shed. The heat inside the corrugated metal structure was suffocating, trapped like breath in a plastic bag. She dragged the heavy drill press back and forth until the concrete floor was permanently scarred. She climbed down into the claustrophobic vault, her boots slipping on the damp cement. It smelled of deep earth-stale water and the sharp metallic tang of raw ore. Arthur had been a coward, but he had been a meticulous hoarder. He had already smelted dozens of the crude yellow bars, stacking them in the canvas bank bags. But hauling them out was agonizing. Each bag weighed nearly 80 pounds. Cora's shoulders screamed, the muscles burning with a hot, tearing pain. Her hands blistered, popped and bled, leaving rusty smears on the canvas. She hauled the bags up the ladder, dragging them across the floor to her Honda. The suspension of the old car groaned, the rear bumper sagging dangerously low toward the tires. Every morning she arrived at the back door of Hollis Metals, just as the sun crested the horizon. Hollis never asked questions. He just locked the front security grate, fired up the crucible and went to work. The back room of the assay shop became a purgatory of blinding heat and chemical fumes. Cora sat on a plastic milk crate, drinking lukewarm black coffee, watching the old man work. He wore a heavy leather apron and a thick visor, using massive steel tongs to feed Arthur's crude bars into the roaring orange-white maw of the furnace. The heat was a physical wall, drying the sweat on Cora's face before it could even form. Hollis used borax and soda ash to draw out the impurities. Black, bubbling slag floated to the top of the molten pool. He skimmed it off, poured the pure liquid fire into graphite molds and let them cool. The hiss of the hot metal hitting the quenching water sounded like a massive snake striking. "Your boy was sloppy," Hollis muttered on the third day, tossing a heavy cooled ingot onto the work table. It clanged dully, a sound of pure density. "Left too much silver and copper in the mix, but the core purity is there." "Just melt it," Cora said, her voice raspy from the fumes. By Thursday afternoon, the work table was covered in rows of gleaming standardized gold bricks. It didn't look like money anymore. It looked like gravity. It looked like ammunition. Hollis kept 30% for the sheer scale of the laundering required. He used a network of shell buyers and offshore wire transfers that Cora didn't even try to understand. All she cared about was the notification that hit her phone on Friday morning while she was eating a stale bagel in her Honda. Transfer received. Ironclad Holdings, LLC trust account. Balance $4,150,000. Cora closed her eyes. The steering wheel was sticky under her bandaged hands. She took a slow, deep breath, smelling the cheap vinyl of the car interior and the faint, lingering odor of nitric acid on her skin. She dialed Naomi's number. "It's there," Cora said when the lawyer answered. "I see it," Naomi replied, the sound of keyboard clacking, bleeding through the line. "I'll initiate the purchase agreement with the Chicago group today. By Tuesday, Ironclad Holdings will own Abernathy Capital's soul. What do you want to do then, Cora?" Cora looked out the windshield at the grey, overcast sky. "We wait for him to trip, and then we break his legs." October arrived with a bitter biting wind that stripped the leaves from the trees and turned the scrubland around County Route 9 into a bleak, skeletal landscape. Cora sat in the cab of a rented Ford F-15, the heater blasting against her numb toes. She was holding a thermos of coffee, watching the heavy steel roll-up door of the shed through the windshield. 3 months had passed. The vault beneath the drill press was entirely empty of the loose bars now. All that remained was the raw vein embedded in the rock, a problem for another day, or perhaps a large-scale commercial mining crew. She had secured the property with a newly erected chain-link perimeter fence topped with barbed wire. It looked exactly like the abandoned industrial dump it was supposed to be. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It vibrated violently against the plastic. Cora looked at the screen. The caller ID read, Richard Abernathy. She let it ring 4 times. The rhythmic buzzing felt like a drumbeat. Finally, she picked it up, pressing the cold glass to her ear. "Hello," Cora said, keeping her voice soft, slightly hesitant. "Cora, it's Richard." The voice on the other end clipped. He was trying for his usual booming authority, but there was a tight, strained vibration beneath the syllables. It sounded like a guitar string tuned past its breaking point. "Oh, hi Richard. It's been a while." "Yes, well, we've both been busy," he said. Cora could hear the faint, muffled sound of traffic in the background. He was walking, fast. "Listen, I'm calling about that scrap of land out on Route 9. The county tax assessor is breathing down my neck again because of the shared last name. It's causing administrative friction at the firm." Cora took a sip of her coffee. It was black and scalding. "I thought you said you weren't going to pay the lien for me, Richard." "I'm not doing it as a favour, Cora. I'm doing it to clean up Arthur's mess," Richard snapped. The facade cracked just for a second before he reeled it back in. "I'm willing to offer you the $5,000 we discussed in July. I'll wire it to you this afternoon. You sign the deed over electronically and you never have to think about that junk shed again." He was desperate. Naomi had called 2 days ago. Ironclad Holdings, acting as the new primary debt holder, had sent Abernathy Capital a notice of deficiency. Richard's firm had missed a quarterly cash reserve threshold by a mere $20,000. It was a technicality, a minor administrative slip, but it was all the contract required. Naomi had triggered the call provision. Richard owed Ironclad Holdings $3.8 million payable in full in 28 days. He was scrambling, liquidating every minor asset he could find to keep the wolves from the door. He still thought the Route 9 property was worthless, but he probably figured he could flip it to a scrapyard or a commercial dump for 10 grand, pocketing a quick $5,000 profit to throw onto the burning pile of his debt. "I don't think I can do that, Richard," Cora said slowly. Silence hung on the line. Then, "Excuse me." "I've decided to keep it," Cora said, her voice dropping the fragile widow routine. It became flat, steady, and entirely devoid of warmth. "It's quiet out here. I think I might clean it up. Maybe start a garden. Are you insane? Richard's voice spiked the anger bleeding through the phone speaker. You can't afford the property taxes. You're living in a rented apartment, for God's sake. The county will foreclose, and you'll get absolutely nothing. Take the 5,000, Cora. Stop being an emotional idiot. Cora looked at her hands. The blisters from July had healed into thick, pale yellow calluses across her palms and fingers. They were the hands of a woman who had hauled $4 million in solid metal out of the dirt. I'm not an idiot, Richard, Cora said. And I'm not selling. Not to you. Not to anyone. Listen to me, you ungrateful. How is the Pearl District project coming along? Richard, Cora interrupted. She said it softly, almost a whisper, but it landed like a gunshot. The silence on the line was absolute. For 5 long seconds, there was only the faint hiss of static. What did you say? Richard breathed. The arrogant bluster was gone. He sounded genuinely rattled. I read in the business journal that commercial lending is getting tight. Cora continued, her tone conversational, pleasant. High-interest mezzanine loans, call provisions. It sounds stressful. I hope you and Beatrice aren't overextended. It would be a shame to lose the firm over a minor liquidity crisis. How do you know about that? Richard demanded. His breathing was heavy now. Arthur talked. Cora lied smoothly. Before he died, he always said you built your house on sand, Richard. It looks like the tide is coming in. She didn't give him a chance to respond. She pulled the phone away from her ear and tapped the red button, cutting the line. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The F-150's heater hummed loudly in the quiet cab. Outside, the wind rattled the heavy chain-link fence she had installed around the property. Cora leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. A slow, vicious smile spread across her face. It didn't reach her eyes, but it felt good. It felt like the first deep breath she had taken in 8 years. She picked up her phone again and dialed Naomi's office. He just called, Cora said when the lawyer picked up. Did he try to buy the land? Naomi asked, a hint of amusement in her sharp voice. He did. For $5,000. Cora started the truck, shifting it into drive. Draft the foreclosure papers on the Pearl District property, Naomi. Do not accept a payment plan. Do not accept a partial settlement. I want the firm. And when we take it, I want you to send the eviction notice to the Elm Street house. November. Stripped the final leaves from the oaks lining Elm Street, leaving the branches looking like bruised knuckles against a bruised sky. Frost clung to the pristine lawns of the neighborhood, a neighborhood that had always felt like a gated community Cora wasn't quite wealthy enough to enter. She parked her heavy F-150 across the street from Beatrice's house. The heater blasted against her shins, smelling faintly of hot dust and engine coolant. She killed the ignition and watched. A massive diesel-guzzling moving truck sat idling in the driveway. It wasn't the meticulous white-glove service Beatrice usually hired to transport her antiques. It was a budget company, the side of the box truck scarred with black scrape marks. 2 burly men in heavy canvas jackets were hauling a velvet chaise lounge down the front steps, their work boots tracking muddy slush onto the porch. Cora zipped up her insulated jacket. The zipper teeth caught halfway a jagged little snag she forced up to her chin. She stepped out into the biting wind, the cold bit immediately at the tips of her ears and the raw, healing skin of her calloused palms. She walked up the driveway, her boots crunching loudly over a thin layer of ice. The front door stood wide open, hemorrhaging the home's expensive central heated warmth into the bitter afternoon. The foyer was a disaster. The smell of harsh chemical floor cleaner fought a losing battle against the scent of damp cardboard and raw panicked sweat. Packing tape screeched violently off a plastic dispenser, a sharp aggressive sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Richard was standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by half-filled boxes. He didn't look like the man who had sat in Abernathy's office 4 months ago. His tailored suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled cashmere sweater and dark, heavy bags beneath his eyes. He was holding a stack of file folders, staring blankly at the wall Cora had once spent a weekend painting. Beatrice was near the kitchen, clutching a porcelain vase to her chest, as if it were an infant. Her immaculate hair was slightly flat, and the sharp, unforgiving daylight streaming through the bare windows highlighted the deep, panicked lines cutting through her foundation. "Careful with that!" Beatrice snapped at a mover carrying a lamp. Her voice was thin, reedy, lacking its usual suffocating weight. "That's Limoges porcelain, you absolute brute!" Cora stepped over the threshold. Her boots hit the refinished hardwood with a heavy, deliberate thud. Richard's head snapped up. His eyes, bloodshot and exhausted, locked onto her. For a second, confusion clouded his face before morphing into a twisted, defensive sneer. "What are you doing here, Cora?" he barked. He dropped the folders into a box. They hit with a dull, defeated slap. "If you came to gloat about the foreclosure notices hitting the local paper, save it. I don't have the time or the patience for your trailer park vindictiveness." "I didn't come to gloat, Richard," Cora said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just sat in the cold air, dense and immovable. Beatrice turned the vase, trembling against her collarbone. "Cora! What is she doing here?" "Richard, get her out. I cannot deal with this girl today. The bank gave us until 5 o'clock. We don't have time." Cora reached into the deep pocket of her coat. Her calloused fingers brushed past the heavy, tarnished brass key she kept there like a talisman. She pulled out a single crisp white envelope. It was thick, heavy stock paper. She walked across the pristine floor, making no effort to walk softly, and held it out to Richard. He didn't take it. He just stared at it, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "Take it," Cora said. Hesitantly, as if the paper were coated in lye, Richard reached out and snatched the envelope. He ripped the flap open, tearing the paper in his haste. He pulled out the single sheet of letterhead. The room went entirely silent, save for the low rumble of the moving truck outside. Cora watched Richard's eyes dart back and forth across the text. She watched the exact moment his reality fractured. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth closed and opened again. The paper in his hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He looked up at Cora, his pupils dilated with pure, unadulterated shock. "Ironclad," Richard choked out. The words scraped against his throat. He looked back at the signature line. "You! It's you! Your Ironclad Holdings!" Beatrice stepped forward, her heels clicking erratically on the floorboards. "Richard, what is she talking about? What is Ironclad?" "She bought the debt, Mother." Richard whispered, his voice cracking. He staggered backward, his calves hitting a taped-up box. He looked at Cora as if she had just unhinged her jaw and swallowed the room. "The mezzanine loans, the call provision, the eviction. She owns the firm. She owns this house." Beatrice froze. The vase slipped a fraction of an inch in her grip. She stared at Cora, the decades of manufactured superiority crumbling into ash behind her eyes. "That's impossible. Arthur left her a junk shed. She didn't have a dime. Arthur left me $4 million in raw wire gold," Beatrice Cora said quietly. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She delivered the words like a doctor delivering a fatal diagnosis. "Buried right beneath the rusted tin can you force me to take. You wanted the family assets to stay with the family. They did." Richard dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up on the dusty wood. He looked utterly broken, a man who had built a paper castle, only to realize he had handed someone else the match. Cora looked at them. She expected to feel a massive, soaring rush of triumph, a cinematic high, but the truth was far messier. Her chest just felt hollowed out, scraped clean. Revenge didn't bring Arthur back. It didn't erase the 8 years of anxiety, the double shifts, the constant belittling. It just ended it. She was tired. bone-deep, soul-achingly tired. "You have until 5 o'clock," Cora said, turning away from them. "Don't scratch my floors." She walked out the front door, leaving it open to the freezing wind. She climbed into her truck, put it in drive, and headed toward the county highway. She drove until the pavement turned to gravel, until the manicured lawns faded into untamed scrubland, until the heavy chain-link fence of the Route 9 property came into view. She parked outside the gate, cut the engine, and finally, for the first time in months, she exhaled. Did you expect that brutal twist? Cora didn't just survive. She became the landlord of her own revenge. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath the heaviest garbage. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good comeback, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, grounded storytelling. What would you have done in Cora's shoes? Let us know in the comments.